My journey as a Superman fan started with a tattered red cape blowing in the wind. That ending rocketed me forward like a red-blue blur through a decade-long origin story and poignant tales of self-discovery and now fatherhood, and backward to the character's very beginnings. Now, on this podcast, we journey together across time and media to examine the stories that have defined the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is the Villain of the Story, Part 2, and joining me to discuss the post-crisis evil businessman iteration of Superman's ultimate opponent, Lex Luthor, is returning guest, Scott Honig. Scott, welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about this one.
As am I. I'm always excited, but this one is a little bit more personal because this is the Lex I grew up with. And we're going to get into so much, but it was really fascinating to now go back and look at some of these stories that I had read as a kid as my introduction to this character, but to now do so with the context of the pre-crisis Lex that I've explored in the past couple of episodes. And I just have an entirely different perspective now. So I'm really excited to compare notes with you. The question that I'm asking everyone in these episodes is whether or not you consider Lex to be Superman's ultimate opponent. That's how I'm describing him in these episodes. But where does Lex fall for you within the hierarchy of Superman antagonists?
For me, he's always been number one. It seems as though creatively he's been poised that way from almost the beginning. But in watching the evolution of Superman as a character and then sort of Lex Luthor along with him, it just seems like he's the one that everybody keeps coming back to, who's, even when they're using other villains from Superman's rogues gallery, it almost always seems to be Lex behind them, pulling the strings in some way, shape, or form, always looming. His next scheme is always on the horizon, even if he's not the A plot of the story. So yeah, for me, he's right there front and center, as he should be.
Indeed. That's why he's getting all these episodes devoted to him. And the follow-up question to that is, when you think of Lex Luthor, which is the version that first comes to mind?
So these days, I see and hear the Bruce Timm Justice League version of Lex. Clancy Brown's voice is in my head. He is a buttoned-up businessman. He's bald, because we've seen a couple iterations where he's not bald. I like him bald. And he's almost always very cool and calm and collected, so that when he gets frazzled, it really means something. But it's that buttoned up businessman Lex that is the version, but specifically the animated one from Bruce Timm.
So I may have said this in one of the prior episodes, I've already forgotten, but for me, and I'll talk about this more next week, but for me, when I think of Lex, I do instantly go to the Michael Rosenbaum Smallville iteration. But the post-crisis 80s and 90s evil businessman looms very large. And within the depictions that you and I are going to talk about over the next 2 hours, probably.
Yep.
Within all of those, the Superman, the animated series, and Justice League iteration, voiced by Clancy Brown and the Bruce Timm design, that DC animated universe version of Lex Luthor, to me, I think represents truly the best of this version of the character. Because I think that we'll get into all of this a lot more, but if there's one problem, like main issue that I had with the comics version of Lex during this time, is that there's almost no humanity or charisma to the character. And I feel like with the animated universe version, you at least get that charisma, that magnetism, where you feel kind of what's emanating from this person and how they could have built all of this. And he's fun to watch and he's fun to listen to in a way that the comics version, though used effectively in a lot of ways, I'm not putting it down, but there was a little bit of a roadblock that I had in terms of really investing in that character in a way that I was able to with the animated version. So for me, that's number one. There's also, that physicality too to the character that you don't see in the schlubbier version that we get, especially immediately post-crisis. So I'm with you. Within this episode that we're talking about, the Clancy Brown version, my number one.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the quality that I'm reading, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that version, that distilled version, it's charming. He has a charm to him. He is, as you said, he's physically imposing, not to the level of Superman because he's got no superpowers, but he's in good shape. He wears really nice clothes, and he's a decent looking guy, and he just oozes charm, which he can turn on and off as needed to make, whether it's to make business deals, and I'm sure we'll get to political deals. And I think that serves the character really well in ways that he's not served when he isn't charming, when they make him look a little uglier, schlubbier, heavier, those tufts of red hair that I don't think do him any favors. There's only so much it's believable that he can accomplish with that physicality. That I'm with you. It strains credibility.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we're on the same page with that. So. Yeah. When last we left our exploration of Lex Luthor at the end of the pre-crisis period, that was the Lex who had grown up in Smallville and hated Superboy. He blamed him for his baldness. He was bent on world domination. He was the mad scientist. He graduated from prison grays to the purple and green jumpsuit, finally to the green war suit, and also had this very surprising and emotionally resonant arc, which I talked about with Rich Roney on Lexor, this planet that had sort of adopted him, and he became the hero to these people. And not to rehash that episode, but the thing that most surprised me by reading all of those pre-crisis stories was how much humanity the character had, and how much of a personal grudge it was between Superman and Lex. I wasn't expecting that as much. I thought it was going to be a little bit more superficial, I guess. But I really found myself buying into this conflict between them in a way I wasn't expecting. So now we are in this post-crisis world in this episode. So Crisis on Infinite Earths has happened. The DC universe has been, or the multiverse now, has been consolidated into one single universe, a new timeline, a new continuity. And we have the John Byrne Man of Steel miniseries that's reintroducing Superman and the Superman mythology. And we've talked about this on the show before, but now Superman is the sole survivor of the planet Krypton. He has a more modest power set. Clark is really who he is. Superman is what he can do, and on and on. And hand in hand with that, we have a real reinvention of Lex Luthor into this, again, this post-crisis, the evil businessman version of the character. And with that comes this tableau that plays out in a number of the stories that we looked at. And it's the image of Superman floating outside Lex's office. And in all of these iterations, Lex gives a speech to more or less the same effect. I own this city. I built Metropolis. Its people work for me. I'm above the law. As he says in Superman for All Seasons, fame is fleeting. Lex Luthor is forever. Superman's responses vary. In most of them, he floats silently. In Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, he talks a lot. And he actually has one of my favorite lines that actually puts that version at the top of my list. But in any event, as I was looking at these stories, we kept coming back to this scene playing out. And I feel like it's a great representation of this new dynamic between them. What was your take on it?
It's funny. So when you originally told me what issues we were going to read and what episodes we were going to watch, I was really prepared for there to be just sort of, you pop in, you get a story, you pop out. But there were far more connections between the different stories than I anticipated. So yes, we saw the scene of Superman outside Lex's penthouse office multiple times, which never gets old. I will always enjoy it. There's something about the visual of it. My favorite actually was in the Superman Adventures issue, Superman Adventures 27, which is done in the animated style of Bruce Timm, written by Mark Millar before he was Mark Millar. And Lex Luthor says, one day Lex Luthor is going to look down upon Metropolis and everyone is going to look up to me. Right. So, and again, playing with that idea of height and elevation over the city. And, the only person higher than Lex Luthor in that tower is Superman, because he can fly. And so and Superman doesn't exploit that necessarily. He doesn't rub it in Lex's face, but just by being there, just by floating outside the window, just higher than Lex is standing, it kind of highlights that no matter how important Lex wants to believe that he is, no matter how much he believes that he owns the city, he calls it my city several times, Superman will always be higher. And I really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed that.
As did I. And you summed up perfectly why that works as such a great representation for this relationship. And the other thing that came to my mind was, I was thinking about what we lost with this post-crisis reinvention. Certainly the scientific mind is one of them. He still engages in experiments, but he has others do his bidding, right? So he's not the one who's creating Bizarro in Man of Steel #5. He has one of his scientists doing it. So, he's still pulling the strings. He's still ultimately responsible, but it's not his hand directly. So you lose that. You lose him out in the field, engaging in a physical confrontation with Superman. There's no more green warsuit, although we get some nods to that in the stories that we looked at. And you do lose the personal history. As much as I've poked fun at that the Silver Age story that gave Lex's origin and why he blames Superboy for the baldness and the fact that that's the root of the antagonism and all that. But still, right, it was an attempt to create this long-standing feud between them. So it's like, okay, these are the things we've lost, but what have we gained? And one of the things that I kept coming back to with that scene of Superman floating is, bear with me on this, but there's almost, I don't know if intimacy is the right word, but there's something about those two, and especially Lex, right? This is Lex being himself. And it's only with Superman. I mean, I guess you can argue when he's with his minions, right? That's when he's dropping his guard as well. But there's a whole other level, though, when it's just him and Superman. And that public facade that has led the people of Metropolis to believe he's this great philanthropist and benefactor, all of that melts away and he shows who he really is. And it's just with Superman through that glass. There's something very, very effective about that.
I agree. And I think that it points exactly to what we gain post-crisis. That is, I think, a superior depiction of Lex than we got pre-crisis. Pre-crisis, because Lex is much more in the field, Superman versus Battlesuit, right? Which puts them on, I don't want to say equal footing, but certainly much closer to equal footing. I think that it simplifies the relationship to, a hero and a villain punching each other until one of them succumbs, which worked for the time. And I think once we got to the 80s, I think what we gain is nuance. And Luthor works really, really well as the person pulling the strings, not the one in the laboratory conducting the experiments himself, but the one who hires the most brilliant and morally questionable scientists to do it for him, or brilliant scientists whose ethics are in the right place, but whom he's blackmailing, or he is paying a stupid amount of money to do these things for him. And what it gives him is plausible deniability, which is something in the pre-crisis he doesn't have. And that's what allows him to have that intimacy with Superman in those flybys, because he knows that he can admit to Superman's face exactly what he's up to, and no one will believe even Superman. He even says in For All Seasons, he says, even those who were present last night when he did something will doubt that it ever happened. So he was playing with this whole idea of alternate facts, or some of the things that have been in the news in recent years. He's really playing with that years and years before. And to me, that's what makes him fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
Well said. And you mentioned alternate facts, and I might as well get this out of the way. I mean, this is a Lex modeled very much after Trump. So much so, one of the stories we read was the unauthorized biography of Lex Luthor, and the cover is the spitting image of the cover to The Art of the Deal. And we talked about this too when we covered the Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era in the earliest episodes of this podcast. And we talked about the President Lex arc and how, it was eerie, some of the ways in which it paralleled what at the time, we were still living through. So, and well, still living through in other ways. So yeah, to sort of see all of that play out, but especially with what we're going through now, it really just puts a whole other spin on these stories. So just to give people, we've mentioned a bunch of them already, but I'll lay out what you and I read and watched in anticipation of this. So John Byrne's Man of Steel #4, which was the Lex-centric issue of the miniseries. I also did reread #5, which is where Lex creates Bizarro.
As did I.
Oh, good man. Look at that. I didn't even put it on the list and you still read it.
It just led right into it, so I kept going.
Superman for All Seasons by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, #3, which was the Lex-centric issue of that. And we've talked about it on the show before, and I did a whole Patreon episode devoted to For All Seasons. But, that was such a gorgeous miniseries, and each one was from the perspective of and narrated by a different member of the Superman supporting cast. And Lex drove issue #3, and it really gave a lot of great insight. And what's really cool about it is it slides right in continuity-wise after Man of Steel #4. So after that issue, Lex is arrested for the first time, right? And then in Superman for All Seasons, you get to see him leaving the jail and plotting his next move. So it's nice how that kind of connected there. The John Byrne miniseries World of Metropolis, issue #1, which was the Perry White-centric issue. I also reread #2, which dealt with Lois, and there were a few pages that I'll mention that shed additional light onto the Lex character. Very curious to get your take on that. Mm-hmm. Superman #2 and #9 by John Byrne, which I feel like both of those, especially Superman #2, I feel like if you're looking for a quintessential post-crisis Lex story, that's the one. This is the famous cover where Lex is sitting in front of the giant computer screen and it says Clark Kent is Superman, and you see how he gets to that point and how he reacts to that. The unauthorized biography, which, man, I got to tell you, I read that as a little kid. I remember having that Prestige format one-shot. I didn't know what I was doing with that. It's definitely a more adult, more mature story. But a lot of drama. It's not very action-packed. And I remember as a kid just not knowing what to make of it. And I never really went back to it. But, man, I enjoyed it now. It's really good. And, Superman Adventures #27, like you said, that's the comic that's set in the continuity and style of the animated series. And then as far as adaptations, the Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, I know there was an episode that I called your attention to. Same with Superman, the animated series. And the Ruby Spears cartoon, I know you don't have access to that. And I did a whole... Oh, you were able to do it. Oh, good man.
I did.
All right, right on. Very cool. So those were the things that you and I took a look at. The one other thing that I want to mention, because I said at the top that this was the Lex that I first met, and that's kind of true, but kind of not, because when I started reading, I was dealing with Lex II. And we did, when you and I talked about the early Triangle era, we got into all of this, but there was this whole storyline where Lex was dying from kryptonite radiation poisoning, and he fakes his death and clones himself a new body and emerges as his own
Luthor's brain.
That's right. They saved Luthor's brain, so it's like he comes back as his own Australian son with this flowing mane of red hair and Australian accent, and takes his father's place and embarks upon a relationship with the post-crisis Matrix version of Supergirl. That's the Lex I met. And I remember in one of those Funeral for a Friend or Reign of the Superman issues, when I was first starting to read, I remember we got Lex's inner monologue and he sort of recapped his history, which was smart because they probably figured a lot of people were starting with the death of Superman, as I did, of course. And so I got a little bit of a recap through that, so I had some context for it. But, that's the Lex that I started with. So, it's been more so over the course of this podcast and some of the other episodes that I've done where I've, gotten a better sense of the true Lex that gave way to that version.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't advise anybody new to Superman to start there if they're interested in Lex Luthor as a character. Not that you had any control over it, because that's just those were the stories coming out at the time. For me, it was Super Friends, the cartoon from the late 70s and early 80s. And that was a Lex who was in his like purple skin tight thing with the green sort of cross straps. And he was the leader of the Legion of Doom, and he stood behind a podium and looked out over all these other villains and plotted ways to take down the Super Friends. And then, of course, the Kenner Superpowers action figures that came out around the same time. But that was green and purple battlesuit Lex. So in my head, like that was Lex. He wore a battlesuit and he fought Superman. And again, for my child brain, it was simplistic enough. It was good versus evil, and it worked. But yeah, I mean, very quickly I was at a point, even around the time of the death of Superman, I was already getting into my teen years, and I was ready for something a little bit more sophisticated. So I'm glad that this post-crisis version existed, and now getting to revisit some of those things, and even some of the TV shows that, I mean, I hadn't seen a Lois and Clark episode since it aired. I hadn't gone back, so that was a treat to get to see John Shea as Lex there, which was a lot of fun. It's
just a shameless plug here, but my wife and I, we've done so far a 4-episode run on my Patreon page. We rewatched and discussed all of season 1 of Lois and Clark, and we will return to cover the remaining seasons, but we have 4 episodes on season 1 of Lois and Clark. So if anyone is curious and wants to listen, I would encourage that. But yeah, I mean, I will say for purposes of those episodes and for this one, it really was interesting to go back and look at Lois and Clark, and especially that version of Lex. And, going back to what we were saying before, I don't know. I don't want to go so far, but the animated series version that we get, maybe we would have gotten there without the John Shea version, but I don't know, because I think that version went a long way. It was still, he was hamming it up, but it wasn't so over the top. There was some, no, you disagree? Well, all right, in fairness. Okay. So the last episode that people heard, Tyler from the Krypton Report, he and I talked about the pre-crisis depictions of Lex in TV, film, and animation. And the last batch of viewing that we had was the Superboy TV series, where actor Sherman Howard played the most maniacal version of Lex Luthor you've ever seen. So by comparison, the John Shea Lex was grounded and subtle and nuanced. Okay. So it's all relative.
All right. I promise I will go and watch an episode of that Superboy series just to compare it. But I mean, everybody on Lois and Clark to me seemed a bit cartoonish, and I get it. I also have to put it into the context of when that show was made, and we didn't have superhero movies and TV shows the way that we do now. So it was picking up cues from comics and creators who had grown up on those comics, making a TV show based on the things that they love. So I get it. And it was still really enjoyable. I loved seeing a young Terry Hatcher. I loved seeing a young Dean Cain, who I always thought was really great in the role. I liked John Shea's performance. I liked the way it was written. I just had to keep reminding myself this was like 1993 or 94, whatever it was, and so once I got that, I was okay. But it was heavy.
It was. But you got to walk before you can run. And I guess I bring that up because I think that there was that charisma there in a way that I don't think you were seeing in the comics necessarily at that time and the time before. So I think in that sense, maybe it broke a little bit of ground there. But going back to the scene of Superman outside the window, the reason I said that, the version from the Lois and Clark pilot is my favorite. So earlier in the pilot, when Clark meets Lex, they have this whole discussion about why the LexCorp Tower is the tallest building in Metropolis. And Lex has this whole thing about how he wants people to look up. And so at the end of that scene, at the end of the pilot, as Superman's flying away, he's like, if you need to find me, just look up. And it's just that jab. Now, on the one hand, you're like, buddy, you got to be a little bit more careful about your secret identity here. You just had a conversation about this as Clark. But anyway.
Yeah. But it was a good stinger. It's a really good stinger.
It was really good. I mean, look, in For All Seasons, again, Superman just floats there. He doesn't say anything. In Superman the Animated Series, he really just stares Lex down and gives him the silent treatment until the very end when he crushes that, the statue, and he says, "I'll be watching you, Luthor." It's like, okay. But I thought, as far as one-liners go, I thought that version in Lois and Clark really, really packed a punch. It was a good line. It was a good button to that scene.
I agree. So wanted to get your take on this, because one of the connections that I saw in a bunch of these that, again, I think really works for this version of Lex, a more nuanced version for a perhaps a more sophisticated audience as the character sort of grows up with us. It seemed to me in almost all of these iterations, each issue and episode, that what Luthor's trying to do is less to fight Superman or defeat Superman and more to undermine Superman. I think that because he wants so desperately to be everybody's idol, he wants everybody to look up to him, he wants everybody to revere him, to worship him, he has to take Superman down a few pegs. He understands that Superman is at least where he is, if not higher, and he hates that. And so the things that he does, the schemes that he comes up with, are not intended, at least on the face, to kill Superman or to get him off the field, but just to sort of show the people of Metropolis and the world that Superman's not as great as you think he is. Was that something that you noticed as well?
I think that's fair for the most part. I mean, I think, there are instances where he does go so far as to try to take him out, but I do think, generally speaking, looking at the big picture of this, I think what you said is accurate. And I was thinking about this a lot too, of like, what does he want, right, in all of these stories? And reading all of them together, I guess, like yourself, a few connection points. I'm trying to think, where's the best place to start this? I mean, there's this idea of everyone having a price. And this actually wasn't in, although that does come up in the indecent proposal thing there. But in Action 600, which you and I did not read for this, but I covered it in an earlier episode last year that I did on the John Byrne era. But there's this short story in Action Comics 600 by Byrne where Lex is trying to blackmail Maggie Sawyer with evidence of her homosexual lifestyle. And he says to her, he's like, one of the sad realizations of my life is that everyone has a price. And again, you see that in Superman #9, where he makes that indecent proposal to Jenny Hubbard, the waitress. So this idea of everyone having a price, he offers Superman money. He offers to put him on retainer in their first encounter in Man of Steel #4. In Superman the Animated Series, in that scene that we've been talking about, he, again, similarly offers to hire Superman, right? He's like, I've started to realize, like, why set my sights on just one city? I can have the whole world, and with the being of your power, we think of what we could accomplish together. So, this idea of everyone having a price, except seemingly Superman. So there's that. And one thing that really resonated in Superman Adventures #27 was, there's a lot going on in that issue, but a very poignant moment where he goes to the statue that has been erected in the honor of Superman. And he says, like, my name is, or I don't know if Matter of Mercy says it to him or he says it, but the fact that, his name is on all of these buildings and hospital wings and things like that. And he's like, yeah, but it didn't cost Superman anything. Mm-hmm. And then finally, going back to For All Seasons, Lex frames all of this, the beginning of the issue, as a love story, not between a man and a woman, but between a man and a city. So he views this relationship with Metropolis, right, as a love story, and feels betrayed by the fact that they have now gravitated towards Superman. And I guess this kind of goes back to, like, if it is a love story, he doesn't know how to love. And we see that time and time again. And it's so twisted. But I guess this idea, if he views it as a love story, he feels like everyone has a price, but he can't get a hold. He can't get an angle on this guy. All of the city's attention now has been diverted to Superman. So, yeah, I mean, to tie this back to what you were saying, it's like, yeah, I mean, to just try to kill Superman, I don't know that that's necessarily the ultimate goal here. I mean, I really do think it is more to undermine, more to recapture that position that he had once occupied. And I guess it's like if he does it through killing Superman, I don't think he would be opposed to that. But I think that's secondary. Like, I really think it is the position that he holds.
I agree completely. And I'm going to take it one step further. I think you're absolutely right about Lex Luthor lacking the capacity to love. He thinks he loves his city, but really it's about ownership. And that's why, and again, that's why businessman Lex works so well for me. The only way he knows how to have a relationship is when it's commerce. And what makes him so bitter, and increasingly so as this era goes on, is that he has spent so much money to make Metropolis his, that when he does not feel he's getting the return on his investment, he loses his mind. He loses his mind. So when Superman comes along and the people worship him to the extent that they do, and he spent no money, right? He spent no money. Lex doesn't know what to make of that. He doesn't understand that relationship, because Superman's relationship with the city, I think, is of genuine love and care. Superman cares about everybody. And the city cares about him in return. And Lex does not understand why they can't do the same for him. In his mind, those two things are the same. Love and commerce, that's the same. Right?
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And the other thing too is when Lex says, it didn't cost Superman anything. I mean, I don't think Superman would look at it as a cost, but at the same time, it's that he is giving of his time. He gave his life in one of the stories. So, and it's like that. I don't think, like you said, like it's just all about the money and the bottom line for Lex. The idea of like he's giving his heart and his soul and his body to the people of Metropolis. That's like nothing, right? Like that doesn't even compute for him.
Yeah. And Superman tries to explain that to Lex in one of, I think of all the reading that we did, my absolute favorite moment, again, it comes in Superman Adventures 27, which was the last place I expected it to come. I had not read that series previously, but I found it was such a beautiful distillation of these characters. Superman says to Lex, "You were blessed with a brilliant mind. You could make the world such a wonderful place. Stop wasting your life trying to destroy it." And Lex still doesn't get it.
Yeah. I want to give a shout out to listener Douglas, because he's been talking to me about that series for a while, because like yourself, it is never kind of on my radar. I might spend some more time on it down the line, because I really liked it too. And yeah, I mean, it's funny because, right, like you said, Superman has this whole speech to him about, like, think about what you could do if you weren't so fixated on me. And there's this moment where, Lex, kind of takes a beat, and Mercy is like, hey, like, yeah, maybe you could take a vacation or something like that. Poor Mercy.
Yeah.
And, when we did our animated series episodes, we kept coming back to Mercy. We were, really, really taken with the long-suffering soldier.
Great character.
Great character. Just so great. But, and for a moment, it's like, you don't know if maybe the message landed. But Lex's takeaway is like, no, like if I've spent this much time and this much money and I haven't gotten the results I want, it just means I need to spend more time and more money. And it is heartbreaking, right? But along the same track, what was interesting, there were a couple instances. One was in Superman Adventures and the other was in the unauthorized biography, where Lex is asked point blank, like, why? Why are you the way that you are? That sounds like Michael Scott from The Office when he's talking to Tony. I hate so much about the things you choose to be. But in Superman Adventures 27, Superman says, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically like, why do you hate me so much? Why are you doing this? And I think the story is called How Much Can One Man Hate? Mm-hmm. And Lex just says, if you have to ask, you'll never know.
Yeah.
And in the unauthorized biography, for anyone who's not familiar with this, it's such a great story, but again, this Prestige format one shot about this alcoholic, down on his luck novelist who starts writing a book about Lex and essentially uncovers, his beginnings here, the fact that he killed his parents for the insurance money. And that was how he got his start. And of course, Lex gets wind of this and has the journalist killed and frames Clark Kent for it, which is an interesting spin on all of this, which we'll talk about. But before the journalist is killed, he has this face-to-face with Lex. And what's so funny about that story is Lex is not in it for most of it.
Nope.
But a couple of
other than in flashback.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But so then he has this sit down with Lex, and Lex is like, oh, I'm just going to pay you a kill fee, and we can have an interview, and what do you want to know? I'll answer anything. If that weren't a clear sign that this guy's days were numbered, I don't know what is. But anyway, so at the end, the guy says, like, why? Like, why do you do all of this? And do you remember what Lex's retort was?
Not off the top of my head, no.
That was interesting. I had to go back myself because as I was preparing for this, I'm like, what did he say to that? Maybe that's telling, right? That it didn't necessarily stick with us. But he says, life is short. That's his response. And he talks about his parents and how they had this self-defeating attitude. And I guess they didn't aspire to greater. And in For All Seasons, he talks about in his narration about how like self-pity is like the worst thing that you can do. And that was one of the lessons that he learned as he was coming up. So I don't, why do I bring this up? I guess this idea that, I don't know, I guess it is kind of ultimately on us to discern the meaning in all of this, because in those instances where the character is presented with an opportunity to fully articulate what this is all about, we don't always get there. I think the love story between a man and a city in For All Seasons, I think that spells out a good bit of it. And I'm not saying it needs to be spelled out, but I just think it's interesting as we're talking about what is all of this about. In the instances where it could be, our hands could be held, they're not, which I thought was interesting.
No, I agree with you, and that idea really worked for me up to a point, and I'll delineate where that point is. So I actually, on its face, I really like the idea that Lex is just naturally ambitious beyond all measure. And the fact that his parents weren't, that they were sort of content with the ordinary, the mundane life that they had, continued to irk him to the point where he needed them out of the picture for two reasons. Number one, so that they're not this constant reminder of Lex's own mediocrity, but also, as you said, because it provides startup capital. So it works. And the fact that he now lives with that resentment, that any time that he feels like on Mercy's prompting to take a vacation, to slow down, to give up, it comes back to him in that moment that I will not be my parents. I will not go down the easy road because I'm better than that. I'm better than everything. And that works as a motivation until I remember Smallville. Because they play with the relationship between Lex and his parents, specifically his father. Lionel Luthor becomes a major player in that show, to the point where I think thematically the show really becomes a story of sons and fathers. That Lex and Clark start out on very similar paths, and one becomes the world's greatest hero and the other the world's greatest villains because of who raised them, because of the men who raised them, Jonathan Kent and Lionel Luthor. And, maybe it was because of John Glover's performance in that role, which I adore. He's also hamming it up, to be fair, but I adore him in that role. And his interactions with Michael Rosenbaum, and it totally works. But the idea that his father was the ruthless businessman who taught him that anything less than that is weakness, and that it will lead to Lex's failure, and he keeps pushing and pushing and pushing until Lex just breaks and becomes the Lex Luthor that we know. So because I love that version so much, the version we get here in the unauthorized biography and For All Seasons only works until I remember Smallville.
Fair. And look, I don't think I'm going to shock anyone by saying that I gravitate toward the Smallville version. I mean, that for me is it. Now, for anyone who's wondering, why aren't you talking about Smallville more in this episode? That's the next episode. So look, the way that I sort of see this, and I'll talk about this more next week, but just to sort of lay this out, as I was mapping out what these episodes would be, I had to draw a line somewhere. And there was something that started to happen in the mid-2000s that at the time, as I was reading, I didn't really know, I don't know if I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't fully appreciate what was happening. And that was what I've come to recognize now as the return, the reinsertion of a number of pre-crisis elements into the character. And for me, this starts in the Public Enemies arc of Superman Batman, where Lex goes nuts and puts on the green war suit again. I feel like from the moment he's in that green war suit through Infinite Crisis, again, we started to see a lot of these elements coming back. He was now the outlaw. They brought back Lena Luthor, his sister. He was now more the mad scientist. And in fact, that had even started earlier, especially when Mark Waid did Birthright. He was now the businessman and the scientist.
Right.
But so I felt like there was this thing that was starting to happen. And maybe most importantly, for me at least, this idea of a shared history in Smallville with Clark and Lex. And so even though obviously Smallville started in the early 2000s, before the other stories that I'm referencing, and definitely dealt for sure with the businessman version of the character, I'm sort of putting that in the next batch of stories that we look at. So that's why. But I agree with you. And that's the thing, the idea of these, poor, alcoholic, abusive parents, it gets you to a point, but I do agree. I think it's far more effective what we get in Smallville. And you're right, it totally becomes a story of these, the fathers and sons. What was one of the things that I thought of, though, in relation to what we looked at today, was they give Lionel essentially the origin story that Lex gets in these stories that we read. So in the Smallville show, we find out that Lionel killed his parents for the insurance money. So that was interesting. Again, so many connection points as I was going through all of these things. Just as another example, I mentioned in that Indecent Proposal story, the waitress, Jenny Hubbard, she comes back in the Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era during the Lex's campaign for president. She's the one who shoots him. And then we find out, Lex set it all up anyway. But so, it's so fascinating to see how these things tie back together. But just one more thing on Lionel. Again, it was so formative for me. The idea that Lex, was raised by this ruthless businessman. He came from money, right? He grew up in this. Yet, as I realize now in looking at all of these stories, that's the exception.
Mm-hmm.
In those pre-crisis stories, we don't get much on his parents, but they don't seem to be of means, right? And then they disown him when he turns to his criminal ways. And certainly in all of these stories, it's the complete opposite of what we get on Smallville. So it's so funny, that's so formative to me, but I recognize that it's an outlier in terms of the family history when it comes to Lex.
It's an outlier and it's a clear reversal. But what stays the same is Lex's rejection, at least at first, of who his parents are, right? In the comics, it's rejection of their mediocrity. In Smallville, it's rejection of the ruthless businessman persona that he tries so hard to avoid it, which is one of the things that makes Lex really a tragic character on Smallville and a sympathetic one, at least for most of the series, I think, in ways that don't always know that he is in the comics. And to address one of your other points, there's a reason, I think, why in the mid 2000s those pre-crisis elements started to come back. I think we like to think that serialized superhero stories are linear, that they just sort of keep going on this sort of infinite timeline forward. But the reality is they're cyclical. And, as readers grow up, many of them leave the comics behind. We get new readers, not as many as I think we ought to have, but okay, we get new readers. And so creators, editors, I think, are very careful to sort of bring back some things, to recycle things, both for nostalgic value for old fans and because new fans won't remember them anyway because they weren't reading at the time. So it made sense that was the point at which we started to return to older versions of Lex, because what we're seeing here, the things that we're talking about, is all building toward President Lex, right? It's businessman from John Byrne from 86 all the way to the turn of the century, where, how do you make it bigger? How do you take businessman Lex, who owns everything, is at the top of the tower, has managed to chip away at Superman in every conceivable way? What's next for him? Politics, right? And the highest office in the state. So, once he becomes president, it puts Superman in the absolute worst position, because Superman can no longer hover outside the window and look down at Lex. He has to stand on a international stage, shake his hand, and congratulate him on winning the election, which kills him, and killed me as a reader too. And that because at the time he still stood for truth, justice, and the American way. I know the motto has changed recently, but at the time it was still the American way. And part of that means it's not that you serve at the feet of the president, but you certainly can't openly defy the commander-in-chief. So it puts Superman in this really interesting position. But once that story runs its course, where else do you go but backwards? You kind of have to retread,
That is an excellent point, and I think that will inform a lot of my reading and viewing as I get ready for the next episode for sure. And I guess to sort of amend my answer from the beginning of the episode, because I was thinking about this leading up to this. The animated series I still would say is number one when we talk about the evil businessman version, but the President Lex tenure really, it was so formative for me. You and I have talked a lot about that Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era, and that was a key part of my Superman reading history. And so I have a lot of personal fondness for that era. And yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think all of the things that we're talking about now, all of the themes and plot points, it all comes to a head in that. So the President Lex is really right up there with the animated version, I think, when we're talking about this. Let's take a quick commercial break, and then we will continue. We'll be right back. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere, via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. And we're back. Okay, so I do want to come back later to the arc across the Triangle era, just in broad strokes, but let's get a little more specific on the issues and episodes that we looked at, as we're already 45 minutes into this here. It's so fascinating. I love talking about all of this with you. So
same.
I guess especially when we talk about Man of Steel and World of Metropolis and even those couple of Byrne Superman issues, number 2 and number 9. And we can go, wherever you want to go as well. But I guess, generally speaking, what characteristics, what traits about Lex really stand out to you as depicted in those Byrne issues, especially?
That what he's trying to do is get under people's skin, to know that someone is beholden to him, or that he's holding something over someone. So I had never read the World of Metropolis series. I'd read the Man of Steel and I'd read the early Byrne stuff, but World of Metropolis was new to me. And I knew, because you and I had already read so much of the Triangle era, the whole idea that Luthor had sired a son with Alice, Perry White's wife, and that was a huge deal in Perry's relationship with his wife and all that. But they worked it out, they reconciled, and he no longer sort of had that power over him. But this is really where it starts, and I wasn't ready for that, and it was a really nice surprise, because I think it's a really interesting plot that Luthor in this issue sells the Daily Planet, and this is where we see him seduce and impregnate Alice, and knowing what would come from this years down the line. His intention to me seemed, I'm going to now forever have something over him, whether he knew that it would produce a child or not. He now always had this thing in his pocket that if Perry White, whether in a personal capacity or professional capacity as editor-in-chief of the Daily Planet, ever did something he didn't like or threatened him or whatever, he could pull this knowledge out of his pocket and use it against Perry.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that is an interesting view on it. I mean, and I don't disagree. I'm just sort of processing that, because I guess the way I looked at it, and this is what made me like Lex less in these stories, is that I guess I didn't take it so much that he was doing it for leverage or power in the future. It really seemed just so cruel. Like, it just seemed cruel. And I guess maybe it could be both, I suppose. And, his ownership of the Daily Planet is certainly interesting. And, I remember from reading the later Triangle years when Lex buys the Daily Planet and shuts it and opens his, Lexcom, and, Lois and Jimmy go to work for him there, and that whole thing. And then they save the planet, which actually doesn't happen until the start of the Jeff Loeb era, when Lois makes her deal with Lex to sell the planet back to Perry for $1 in exchange for Lois killing one story of Lex's choosing in the future. So, But in any event, in that world of Metropolis, you see he used to own the planet. I mean, what he did to Perry really just struck me more as cruel, and you see other instances of that in that story. So that's when I was asking, what characteristics. I guess for me, it's like cruelty really seems to rule the day when it comes to this version of Lex. Going back to what I was saying before, though, about what we lose in the post-crisis version, you lose that history with Superboy. It was interesting that they now position Perry White as the childhood friend, former best friend of Lex Luthor. And it's just interesting. I guess they like the idea of Lex having a past with one of our characters. But now, in terms of what's been established and characters' ages and things like that, like Clark, that doesn't make sense anymore. And I've always felt Perry deserves more play. So I kind of like that. And that is the version I grew up with. And there were later stories that did reference their history together. But reading that story, it's like, we haven't seen anything, there's nothing that's established in that story that points to a falling out or anything like that between the two of them. It's like, as far as we know, they're still friends, and at least they have this history of friendship. And so for Lex to let Alice think that Perry has perished, reporting overseas, right? He's been gone for, a year or 2 years, and, he makes his move on her, and then he throws it in Perry's face when they're all together. He has his assistant come out and make a big show about, Alice, we found your jewelry in the master bedroom or whatever it is. Like, it just like twists the knife. It's so messed up.
It is. It's cruel on the face of it. But I also think it speaks to one of your earlier points that while, yes, they established that Lex and Perry had been friends, I don't see this Lex as being able to have genuine friendships and genuine relationships. Everything is a pawn on his chessboard to be used now to perpetuate an act of cruelty because why the hell not? But also to hang on to for later should he need it. And it turns out years later he pulls that out, and it is a stain on Perry and Alice's relationship, for a while. And the fact that the son that is produced has issues of his own that cause trouble for them as a family, and that Perry has to now weigh how he's going to deal with this trouble. He's got substance abuse issues, right? And ultimately he ends up dying in a battle that we didn't love, the Blaze Satanis War thing, but the effect is there that Perry has to wrestle with the child that he raised, who, many of his horrible qualities may just be due to his genetics, that he's Lex Luthor's biological son. And so for me, that's an interesting angle for Perry White, who I agree with you really needs more screen time. I think that it made more sense in this iteration to have Lex and Perry share the childhood relationship, because if Clark is in fact that sort of perpetual 30 to 35 years old, the way that Lex is presented here, that does not work. Lex is clearly in his 50s, right? He's much more a contemporary of Perry White, so it works a lot better. Whereas, on Smallville, for instance, Tom Welling and Michael Rosenbaum look as though they are contemporary, so that works.
And they'll play with that in the stories that we look at in the next episode. But yeah, you're right. Yeah. For purposes of this, no, I do think it made sense. And like I said, it just was striking to me that there was still this effort to create a shared past between Lex and one of the core cast members. You bring up the passing of Jerry White, right? The biological son of Lex and Alice, raised by Perry and Alice. And, we talked about this when we did our Crisis Till Death event last year, but I was reflecting on it when I was doing the preparation for this, because I feel like it's one of the only instances in these stories, in this version of Lex, where he shows any kind of humanity, when he genuinely appears affected by the death of Jerry. But in all of these other stories, again, the cuckolding of Perry White, in World of Metropolis #2, which I know I didn't assign, but that's the Lois-centric one. And basically she's like 15 and she's trying to get a job at the Daily Planet, and she breaks into LexCorp and she's trying to get dirt on Lex, and she's apprehended. And one of his minions basically like strip searches her. And Lex makes a remark later on about, I look forward to meeting you again in 10 years, but in the meantime, I'll content myself by reviewing the tape of your strip search. And I'm paraphrasing slightly. But, it's like you read that and it's just like, it's one of those things. I'm going to make an Office comparison to lighten the mood here. Okay. So there's one of my favorite episodes of The Office, real quick, is Threat Level Midnight. We find out, Michael Scott, he's been making this independent movie over all of the years. And then season 7, we get to finally see what he's been making all of these years. And so he plays Michael Scarn. He's like a James Bond-esque character. And Jim in The Office, our lovable everyman, he plays the Golden Face, the villain of the piece. And he has a line in Michael's movie where he's like, I'm going to dig up your wife's corpse and hump her. And everyone in the bullpen in The Office, as they're watching Michael's movie, they all cringe. They're like, oh. And then we cut to a talking head of Jim, and he's like, I didn't love the dialogue, but I was just trying to, get some FaceTime with the receptionist. Like, right, that's... But it's one of those things where it's like you watch this, and that's the thing where I guess this leads to one of my big questions for you as we approach 1 hour here. One of the big questions, because I feel like I said, I was struck by what I found to be a fair amount of humanity in the pre-crisis Lex, especially on Lexor. He has a wife, he has a son, the planet's destroyed. Like, it really, it gets to you. And, we get to Smallville, which again is a favorite of ours. And it's like, you feel for this guy. He's the nicest guy in town at the start of the show. Yeah. And he's lied to, he's deceived the whole show. And he ends up the way he does. And it's like, you feel for him. But there's this period in between where Lex is leering after an underage girl. He's, putting his supposed best friend through this torture. In Superman #2, one of his scientists there, Amanda, I mean, we talk about, Me Too. This is like Me Too and then some. I mean, he forces her essentially, into this sexual relationship with him. So all of these instances of this, and it's hard it's hard to find any humanity in this version of the character. And it's funny. I don't know if this is because of the way it was written or just because you don't have a performance the way you do on TV or even in animation. But again, there's no charm or charisma to sort of counterbalance there. So you're really just left with ultimately a very cold and cruel person. And I guess my question is that okay? Like, I mean, his behavior is not okay, but I'm saying like this depiction of the villain of the story. It's like, does he need to have humanity? Because I'm sitting here, I'm like, he doesn't know humanity. Does he need to? I guess that's my question.
Does he need to? No, he doesn't need to. I'm personally a fan of villains who are in some way relatable, whose mission, whose plight is understandable, even if you don't agree with it. And certainly their methods is sort of where they lose you as an audience, right? You can understand what they do. So, for instance, an Eric Killmonger in Black Panther, right? You understand why he wants to deliver Wakandan technology to African Americans so that they can, rise up and sort of reclaim a world that was taken from them. But the way he goes about it is completely heinous. So it's not that you need it, but I think it helps. I think it's always a more compelling story when the villain makes some good points and the hero still has to take them down, where it becomes as much a philosophical debate as it does a physical confrontation. At the end of the day, comics, animation, they're all visual media, so it's still going to have to be some punchy. But I like when it can be thinky. I agree with you. I think this Lex veers a little too far into the irredeemably cruel. It kind of finds its way back a little bit as the years go on, but they really go pretty far. And I'll say John Byrne. I mean, at this point, he's the architect of the era. I mean, John Byrne, I think, takes him to some places that are uncomfortable, that are really uncomfortable. If he weren't a villain, it would be a bigger problem. But if he's the central antagonist, he's a villain. Villain's gonna villain.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. Like, these definitely were the Byrne stories most of all that really, really leaned into the morally reprehensible, irredeemable. And, I don't know. It's like, on the one hand, this was, I guess, really planting a flag in this version of the character. Like, this is who he's going to be. And, so it is what it is. But so, yeah, I mean, I guess, no, you're right. I mean, going back to my questions, like, no, it doesn't need to have, the redeeming qualities. But yeah, for myself as a reader, as a viewer, I think I definitely want some of that. I do think it makes it more interesting. And, in the next episode, again, we'll talk about a lot of stories where you do have this personal, animosity and history between Superman and Lex. And in the final episode of this event, we'll look at those stories that take a more philosophical approach to the differences between them. And yeah, I do find those more compelling. Again, there's a lot. I mean, overall, I like the evil businessman version, but especially in these early Byrne stories that we're talking about, it's real tough. I guess this idea of counterbalance, like, there's just nothing to sort of even it out, and it gets a bit bleak. I mean, I feel like the best / worst example of this is Superman #9, this backup story in Superman #9, where, Lex goes to this diner, was it 900 miles outside Metropolis, and he makes this offer to the waitress, Jenny, to spend a month with him for $1 million. Now, I've never seen the movie Indecent Proposal, I will admit. Have you seen it?
I have, and this issue of Superman predates that movie.
Oh, does it?
I believe.
Oh,
yeah. I believe so.
Oh, interesting. Well, what was funny was that I at least watched the trailer for Indecent Proposal, and I think there was $1 million for a night.
It's for a night, yeah.
Yeah, here's $1 million for a month. Not as good a deal. I know it's a long time ago, but it wasn't that much of a difference in time.
But there are some similarities, because what you get is of a very rich man who specifically targets a hard on their luck couple and makes this proposal. It would essentially solve their financial problems, right? So in one sense, it's very generous, but what he's asking in return goes beyond the night or the month, because now it's him going off afterwards with the knowledge that happened. And it's something that couple, that they can never take it back. So while they might be enjoying their $1 million, they're always going to know where that money came from. It will be tainted. And that's that cruelty. He's not, I don't think he's into it because he has his sights set on a month of passionate lovemaking with this one waitress. It's the knowledge that he has insinuated himself into this relationship. And essentially that relationship will deteriorate and it will fall apart. And so what's the $1 million worth at that point? And of course she ultimately turns it down, right? I mean,
well, I think the kicker to that is that he leaves before, like, she comes out to tell him her decision or something to that effect. And it's this idea. I think what he really gets off on in that story is that, like, she'll never know if she would have gone through with it. That was the thing.
Right.
And definitely a ton of parallels. No, I was just, when I brought up the difference in the amount, I was just like, Lex's deal, was a little on the cheap side,
there's one other key difference it's worth bringing up. In the movie, it's Robert Redford, right? Who has the charm of the Luthor that we love from, I mean, he's got hair, but he is ultimately that guy, right? Whereas in the comic here, it's schlubby, tufts of red hair Lex Luthor, who, no woman in her right mind would really want to sleep with him. What makes the movie work in ways that the comic didn't necessarily work is, you get a night with Robert Redford out of the deal as well. So it's not like a total loss. And I think that works for the movie. And as just sort of, for Jenny, it's just the money.
Right.
It's just the money. Whatever else happens, just the money.
Right. But yeah, I mean, the fact that he's, playing this game with her, her dignity, her integrity, and that, it's like, again, it's really, he leaves before she even makes that decision. And it's like the idea of torturing her with, like, would I have ever actually gone through with it? And again, like, the Perry White thing is one thing, and, they have a history, and, to your point, maybe it was an idea, to maybe get some leverage down the line, like, whatever it was. But this idea, and it's made clear that this is not the first time he's done this, right? Like, this is a regular habit of his, to just, like, randomly pick people to torture. That's where it was really hard to reconcile, that version of Lex with, I guess, what I think of when I think of the character, because I can't, certainly the Smallville version, I could never see doing that, or the animated series version. It's like, but even, later Triangle era, it's like, I couldn't see doing that per se. It was just, it was so over the top, and so, again, so cold and so needlessly cruel. And, I mean, it I don't know. It's like, it shows you who this character is. So I'll give it that. But yeah, it was, again, it was really overall pretty off-putting.
Yeah. And I think where it ultimately fails is in the wasted potential, because the idea of businessman Lex Luthor allows for complexity and nuance in ways that I think mad scientist Luthor, for instance, does not. Battlesuit Lex does not. As a point of contrast, where we see, I think, that full potential realized, for instance, to bring it full circle to the very first time you and I ever recorded anything together, to the Batman No Man's Land story, where Lex is not a major player in it, but at the end, he sort of swoops in and offers his vast fortune to help rebuild Gotham City. But there, as always, there are strings attached, right? So this is businessman Lex getting to use the wealth and the influence to ultimately, whatever it is that comes out of it, he still does good with the money. He still helps to build Gotham City back up after this cataclysmic event. Now, that ultimately leads to the bid for the presidency and on all the bad things that happen as a result. But that's my point about complexity and nuance, because at the end of the day, if you're a citizen of Gotham, having just been through hell, Lex Luthor is very much your savior. He rebuilt your apartment building, or he, helped to finance the rebuilding of the store that you own, or whatever way you personally benefit from.
And I know we talked about this, and that was a Patreon episode that we did years ago now. But Batman No Man's Land was my introduction to Batman comics, and it still holds a very special place for me. And I love Lex's entrance into that storyline for all of the reasons that you said. And it's this, like in No Man's Land in particular, I don't know that the No Man's Land designation would have ended had it not been for his intervention, right? So he is doing good, but he's also forging these land deeds. And by the end of it, his aim is to own Gotham. Like he owns Metropolis, and, Batman's able to put a stop for that. But to that,
and the visual of him too, arriving by helicopter, right? So he arrives from the sky the way Superman does. The irony of that is not lost on me anyway.
Or I'm sure on Batman either.
Right.
But that's the thing overall with this version of the character that we get from, 86 through 2003. And I know we continue to get shades of it, in more recent stories, but the fact that, like you said, it's not this physical confrontation. It's not Superman versus Lex in the armor. It's that Lex has fooled the public, and there's this public facade, and Superman, as much as he might thwart Lex's plots, is never able to pin anything on him. And two clear instances of that in the issues that we read, Man of Steel number 5 and Superman Adventures number 27, both stories begin with Superman bringing the remains of a robotic adversary to Lex and being like, I got you now. Like all of these parts came from LexCorp. Like this is you. And Lex, of course, is ready to go. And he's like, no, you'll see that all of these parts were listed as stolen and that the suit was piloted by a recently fired employee with a grudge. So, he has all of his bases covered. And so that's the thing.
That, by the way, appears also in that Ruby Spears episode with the Defendroids. He's the same plot device. Yep. Yes.
The thing, what's cool about the Ruby Spears is that, that was the first on-screen depiction of the post-crisis Lex. So, notable in that sense. What was, just as a quick side note, what was your take on the vocal performance of Lex in that series?
It's 80s cartoon. So full disclosure. So I have this uncanny ear for voice actors because I grew up on cartoons. So you hear the same voices over and over and over again. So I'm blanking on his name, but the voice was so familiar to me because he had played so many roles on cartoons growing up. So it was totally familiar. I had watched that series as a kid. I haven't watched it since, but it all sort of came back to me, which was nice. But it was interesting to see that the connection plot-wise between that one episode of that show that only lasted one season of 13 episodes, something like that, and the two separate issues that we see from two different Superman series decades apart, and yet they're going back to that same well of, I got you now, here are your robots that I can trace easily back to you. Nope, stolen parts. It's so that idea of like, he always makes sure he has that backdoor of plausible deniability. Always.
Yeah, totally. And that's what makes this version of the dynamic so interesting. Superman knows, Lex knows, we know, but the public doesn't know, and Superman can't prove it. Now, I guess at a certain point when we talk about the ethical responsibility of Superman, and we talked about this. I talked about it with you, and I talked about it with San Gregorio when we did our Loeb Kelly episodes at the very beginning of this podcast, when we talked about the President Lex arc. But I think the same question can be asked even before President Lex. Like when Lex is up to all of this and Superman knows it and he can't prove it, I'm not saying he should kill Lex, but at what point is it is it imperative that Superman, not worry so much about the letter of the law, but instead maybe put Lex in a special room in the fortress or throw him in the Phantom Zone? Again, I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but at the same time, it's like at a certain point, I feel like it kind of begs the question. It's like, okay, you can't You can't prove it the way you need to prove it in a court of law, but you know he's bringing about this harm. And are you not responsible for a greater harm by allowing this to happen? I'm not saying kill him, but do you take it upon yourself to imprison him, incapacitate him in some way?
So here's the other nuanced, complex part of Lex Luthor, the businessman, that I love, that sort of developed much later towards the presidency, right? So we're moving sort of out of the John Byrne era and through the triangle and all that, is because they've built up LexCorp to be what LexCorp turned out to be. If Lex is taken off the chessboard, that's thousands of people out of work. That is a catastrophic decline in the stock market. It's projects that are actively making Metropolis better that are now halted. So this isn't just a matter of removing one villain and stopping him from doing his villainous things. Luthor has this grapple hold on the city, and I would say it probably extends beyond just the city and to the national or international level, that makes it almost impossible to remove him, certainly without begging a lot of questions, but without sort of weakening the corporate infrastructure of the whole country in some ways.
Your point is well taken, and I think that's a valid explanation for that. And sort of a more literal, tangible counterpoint to that, very early on in Superman #2, Lex gets a hold of kryptonite and fashions it into a ring. So now there's actually this physical impediment to Superman taking that sort of action. And, Lex will ultimately pay the price for that, because he'll lose his hand, and then later, he would lose his life, but for transplanting his brain into the body of his cloned quote unquote son. But so, there, in fairness, there is that wrinkle to it too. But I think your answer, definitely is the more interesting one and speaks to the larger picture in all of this. And not to mitigate what Lex is doing, but he's not like he's like slaughtering people. You know what I mean? It's, and again, I don't mean to minimize the evil that Lex is doing, but I do like to think if it rose to a certain level, Superman would, would take the necessary action. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, and that's ultimately, I think, where my interpretation that went all the way back to his dealings with Alice, where that comes from, that idea of having everyone and everything in his pocket, because by having an outward facing philanthropic persona, he covers himself. Should anyone actually discover anything about him, or should Superman try to actively take him down, he's covering himself. He even covers himself in death. I mean, this happens. He can't. All his wealth can't stop it, and he has a plan in mind to keep his brain and put it in another body. So, he's always those couple steps ahead. And to even bring it back to the first question you asked me, I think that's ultimately why he remains Superman's #1 antagonist for me, because he is the brains to Superman's brawn. Not that Superman's not smart. He's very, but he's not Lex Luthor level smart or Bruce Wayne level smart. And so Lex is always, in the same way that Batman is always one step ahead of the majority of his villains, Lex is always one step ahead of Superman.
Exactly. And so on the note of Lex the Second, two things. One, I was thinking about how, and now I can say this with some confidence, it's never been adapted. There have been nods to it. Like in the Reign of the Superman animated movie, when Lex goes out in disguise, he puts on a red wig.
Right.
And in Smallville, Lex ultimately saves himself in the later seasons through cloning, but he's not posing as his own son. And I don't know, just interesting to me that that's never been. I'm not saying it should. Maybe it's best left alone. But it was just interesting to me that there are all these stories, they all get recycled and come back in some way. At least yet, we haven't seen that come into play.
I don't know that we will or need to.
Well, you never know. So there's someone who maybe grew up on that version of Lex. Maybe they have an opportunity to write something. Yeah, it might find its way.
You're right. You're right.
The other thing was, And I don't know, maybe the writers of the Triangle era of the time, maybe they've addressed this in an interview or something like that. I don't know offhand, but part of me wonders if they did the Lex II to sort of, I don't know, absolve Superman to an extent. Because that's the thing with this. It's a great dynamic. Superman can't get the goods on Lex, can't prove it. So they always have this back and forth. But at a certain point, does Superman not look, when we're talking about year after year after year, does Superman not start to look a bit ineffectual against this adversary? You know, in Pre-Crisis, like Lex kept breaking out of prison, but like Superman caught him and he brought him back. It was more of a failing of the prison system that he kept escaping. But right. Here it's like at a certain point, what are you doing, buddy? And so that's why I wonder if there was this idea to sort of give it a restart, a refresh, because now as far as everyone, including Superman, knows, this is a different person who wants to do better than his father and is not the same guy. So it sort of like resets the clock, I guess, on you know, this the dynamic between them. I wonder to what extent that was kind of fueling it, where it sort of gives Superman a little bit of a break.
Yeah, and what I thought worked best about it was the fact that Superman suspected from the beginning that this was every bit the Lex Luthor that his quote unquote father was. And so he is extremely distrustful, even as the city embraces him fully. And women are excited by him, and, you know, he's lustrous mane and this, you know, much more physically fit body. And, you know, so it allows for a dynamic between Superman and Lex that we really hadn't seen before, which was, for all intents and purposes, for the good long while, Lex's intentions were purely good. He really does present himself to both the characters in the book and to the readers as though this is not the Lex Luthor that we know. This is a good human being who's really trying to do the best he can for the city and its people. And to have Superman actively trying to now undermine him, a nice reversal of what the previous relationship had been, is a different version of the character that we'd seen. Now, the fact that it ultimately unreverses itself and it was all a ploy, okay, again, comics is cyclical, and, you know, it's always going to sort of, we get a new take and then it's going to revert back. But I don't know, it fails in some ways, but in that regard, I think it really succeeds.
Yeah, and look, it's hard for me to separate out because there's this fondness from my childhood, and I don't know where that ends. But I do think there's something kind of interesting about it. I think it also points to the ultimate corruption and hubris of this character. That that's I feel like one of the tragedies of Lex Luthor, and maybe the tragedy in this version, where it's like he has a fresh slate, like he has the opportunity to live again, and to chart a different path for himself, but he just cannot help himself. So there is maybe some element of tragedy there. How well do you remember Lex's arc over those Triangle years, from Lex II through the presidency?
I think I've got a pretty good grasp on it.
Okay, cool. I mean, not that we need to, spend a ton of time on it, and I will be covering that. We have an event coming up later this year on the podcast. You'll be a part of it. So we'll be talking about the next few years of the Triangle eras. Last year we did Crisis Till Death. This year we're going to do Death Till Wedding. And then next year we'll cover the Electric era. And then that brings us right up to the Loeb Kelly era that we started this podcast with. So we'll have covered the entirety of the Triangle era on the show. But it was just interesting. And I was kind of jumping around on the DC app and pulling up, various issues that, I remembered from over the years. But essentially that cloned body that Lex had created for himself, eventually deteriorates. And Lex is, at least temporarily, brought to justice for his role in the destruction of Metropolis. He's finally able to beat the rap by basically claiming that all the actions were done by a deranged rogue clone of his, not the actual Lex. Right. But still you have this emaciated, deteriorating cloned body. And then he is restored to full health in that Underworld Unleashed event where he makes a deal with Neron, the devil, essentially, and trades his soul for renewed health and vitality. And at that point, he comes back as, so this was like 1996-ish, I want to say, maybe a little bit later. Yeah. But he comes back as the Lex physically that we've been with ever since. Because, again, in those early Triangle years, like very schlubby. He's balding at the very beginning, schlubby guy. Then he's got the Lex II physique. the emaciated clone body. And then he comes back, I think, like the very fit version that we've been with ever since. He marries the Contessa and he fathers Lena Luthor. And I actually read the issue, Superman number 131, where Lena is born. And I have a couple things that I wanted to mention about that. He sacrifices Lena to Brainiac 13 at the end of the Y2K storyline, at the beginning of the Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era. Superman returns Lena to Lex at the end of Our Worlds at War. Mm-hmm. And he says something to Lex in that scene that I thought was worth mentioning here. He says, "We are small men in a large universe, Lex." And then he goes on to say, essentially, like, you have a second chance with your daughter. As far as I know, she kind of like disappeared not long after that. I think she made like a couple of fleeting appearances and then presumably was erased in Infinite Crisis. I don't know. But that basically takes us right up until, Lex becoming president. It's like, that's sort of, I guess, a snapshot of his arc, across the Triangle era, which really, again, was the height of when I was reading Lex in the 90s.
Yeah, it's sort of wild and dramatic in ways that superhero comics often are, right? I mean, it's, they're the everyday problems and conflicts that we have just hyperbolized to the nth degree. I mean, that's essentially it's how I pitch it when I teach them as American mythology, right? It's our world, but just sort of heightened to as far as we can heighten it. So in that sense, it makes sense. But in looking at that whole path, while individual bits of it are exciting, and there's some really great stories in there by some really talented creators, it also makes you wonder what might have happened had there been sort of one consistent creative vision over all of that to make sure that the businessman Lex, had consistently that the nuance and the complexity, I'm going to come back to those words, that he might have had, because by the time he becomes president, obviously the readers are asking the same questions that a lot of the characters are asking who are in the know, which is, how could this happen? I mean, how on earth could the nation elect this man who we all know is one of the greatest supervillains ever? How could he be elected president? And I know this is not a political podcast, but I think the questions were answered not that long ago. Because again, as you pointed out, Lex Luthor in the 80s is very much modeled on businessman Donald Trump. And even though Lex's presidency precedes Donald Trump's by a decade and a half, Trump's rise to the presidency from the world of business is eerily parallel to Lex's. This idea that Lex had sort of built himself up financially on the world stage and had done enough good and had his hand in enough things that enough people didn't see him as this ultimate villain. And so even when these moments came out where he was outed for having been involved in this, or something public came to light, Lex was right when he says, look, even though a lot of people saw this with their own eyes, they're not going to believe it. Again, if you doubt the veracity of that statement, you just had to watch the presidential election of 2016 to see it play out. I mean, we had, audio of a presidential candidate talking about, groping women during the campaign. And that didn't put the nail in the coffin of Kane. And in fact, he still won despite that. So, I wonder if we had gotten a version of Lex that really kind of took advantage of that trajectory, that would have been even more eerily prescient than it already is.
That's okay. So when we talked about President Lex, I think I talked about this with you and with Mike when we did those episodes.
Yeah.
And I know you guys were sort of on one side of this and I was on the other, where I feel like with the comic version of Lex, it was more, and I'll tread lightly here on the politics of it, but it was more understandable to me that the people of the DC universe would think he's this good guy. Because even though, again, he had been brought to trial, as far as people knew, it was a clone who had done all of it.
Right.
So very over the top, but this idea that I think the comic version of Lex had more or less over the course of those Triangle years, maintained that facade. And even when it was shattered, he was able to rebuild it. In contrast to what we saw in the real world, where there were these very specific, extreme instances that were still not enough to sway people. Whereas in the comics, it's like I could kind of understand how the people of the DCU would still reasonably think he's a good enough guy. And that's where I felt like Superman didn't do enough. That's where I felt like, and I look, I understand the tension that they were building here, and they wanted Superman to ultimately feel betrayed by the choice that the people made. All I'm saying is that for me, I think the story would have landed more if Superman had made that public stance and the people still chose Lex. And because then I just feel like I don't know, it just would have tracked a little bit better for me. Because like Superman was like, oh, I'll take a back seat. Like they won't elect him, but it's like, they don't know what you know. And maybe I'm just overthinking this or taking it too literally, but I think that was the thing that kind of bugged me. It's like, they don't know what you know. If you tell them and they still choose Lex, then punching the moon like he does, or, you know, a moon, not our.
Right.
You know, in anger, I feel like that would resonate a little bit. Again, overall, I still like the story a lot. I think it works. It's not the hill I'm going to die on, but I think that was sort of just the one gripe that I had with it.
Well, at what point in that proposed story does Superman become more cynical than anybody's comfortable with? You know, the fact that he takes the back seat during the election in a naive hope that America will make the right choice, and then is disappointed when they don't, as opposed to interfering. And it would have been, it would have been an interference with the democratic process to hold up this villain and say, look, here's what he's done that I know about that you don't know about. And because I'm Superman, you'll believe me. You know, at that point, I think we lose an element of Superman that I don't know that we want to lose.
Interesting. So kind of on that note, I know I didn't assign any of this, but
yeah,
I was folding laundry the other night and I just like I was skipping around Justice League and Justice League Unlimited episodes. And Jeremy, who did the Superman animated episodes with me, next year, we're going to do a whole thing on Justice League. So we're going to unpack Justice League a lot more, same way we did the animated series of Superman. But I was skipping around to some key Lex episodes. And man, one of my favorites is The Clash.
Remind me, I don't remember it off the top of my head.
So at this point, what's fascinating about Justice League and Unlimited is that you see Lex kind of run the gamut of all the versions that we've seen. So, you know, I think one of the first main times we see him is in Justice for All. And at the beginning of it, he's finally exposed for the villain he is. And he finds out he's dying from the kryptonite radiation and all that. But he escapes and he puts on the purple jumpsuit sort of thing, like, you know, just like in Pre-Crisis. But then later he reforms and he announces a bid for the presidency. And Captain Marvel, you know, sort of naively, innocently makes this comment to the press of like, hey, like, isn't it great that someone like Lex can have the opportunity to run for president and turn his life around? And the Justice League, Superman in particular, like they really take him to task for that. And Superman is like, listen, you do not speak on behalf of the League. Like we do not take a stance on politics, which I guess runs counter to what I was saying, but it leads to a larger point. So Lex announces this, you know, this housing project for the poor, and they build this entire development, and it's empty. No one's moved in yet, and they have this benefit. And long story short, now people who know the episode know what I'm talking about, but Superman is set up, right? Like Lex makes it seem like there's this bomb that's about to go off. And so Superman starts to, you know, try to get to the bomb, and Captain Marvel intervenes. He's like, stop, like, what are you doing? And they quickly come to blows, and their battle just demolishes this housing development. And again, Superman gets played because they ultimately find the quote unquote bomb. And it was really just this power source. And Superman looks awful in the eyes of the public through this. And, you know, he's absolved somewhat because, again, he was ultimately set up. This was during the Cadmus arc. So there was a lot going on, right, to discredit the Justice League in the eyes of the public. But the thing about it that I loved then and I love now is it shows the fallibility of Clark, of Superman. It's like, you know, he let his anger get the better of him. And I'm not saying I want that to be his default setting, but when it happens, I like it. And it's like, I think in that animated arc and in the President Lex comic storyline, I think it's very potent and it's very believable that he would get to that point. So that's what I guess this is a long-winded way of saying, to your point. It's like, I get what you're saying. It would kind of like lose something if he inserted himself in that way. But I also feel like if there were ever a place for it, like the stakes are so high that I think it would track. But yeah, watching that episode, it's like Superman doesn't come off great in it. And the episode gives him an out, but I'm still like, no, like I get it. Like it just shows, I don't know, it shows the humanity of him that he would be that pissed off.
Yeah, no, I see a version where it works that Lex Luthor is so manipulative that Superman loses it. He loses his cool. He makes a mistake. He does something uncharacteristic, or he just allows himself to get so emotional about it because, again, he knows that he's being played and there's nothing he can do about it because Lex is ultimately the superior mind. And Superman not only having the moment, which is interesting and exciting in and of itself, but then his reflection on that moment, where he'd get real down on himself for allowing himself to lose his cool in that way. And I don't know that we saw enough, maybe not enough of that. Again, I don't know that I want to see it go so far as him interfering with that democratic process, but I do see moments where it might have been really effective to have him bested in a way, not physically, but mentally bested by Lex Luthor. And, I think the first time that the stories that we read sort of drop that ball are right from Superman 2, Superman number 2, the issue, where, one of his employees runs this algorithm based on all this information that spits out the inevitable conclusion that Clark Kent is Superman, as the cover decries. And what should have been a moment of Lex Luthor finally realizing that he has the leverage that he's always wanted on Superman, his arrogance does not allow him to accept that is true. Now, part of that is, the brilliance of the Clark Kent Superman dynamic, that Clark has done such a good job of presenting himself as, someone who could never, ever, ever be mistaken for Superman. But on the other hand, for as smart as Lex is, I don't necessarily buy that 100%. He dismisses it on its face. Goes so far as several years later as to have this woman murdered, which we talked about in one of the Triangle Era episodes, because she continuously tries to prove that this is in fact true, and Lex won't have it. So, that could have been, I think, an opportunity to start playing that out as well, where if he's got it over Superman, then we could see this deterioration of Superman's confidence in himself and in his relationship with Lex.
Oh, all right. A couple of things, but do you want to take a break or do you want to just power through? You tell me. Either way.
I'm good. I'm good.
Good, man.
Yeah.
Audience,
I'm having fun.
Audience, I hope you're with us. I'm enjoying this so much. Okay.
Yeah.
So with Superman number 2, yes, and Lex's refusal to accept the results of this computer program. So he says no man with the power of Superman would ever pretend to be a mere human.
Yeah.
And I and it's like the last couple of panels of the issue. It's real quick. I wish that had gotten more play. Also in that issue, the one main thing that we haven't mentioned yet, Lex has Lana brutally tortured for information on this. He also has agents go to the Kent farm and knock out the Kents with darts, but they're okay. But kidnaps Lana and tries to get information out of her. I mean, it's when Clark finds her in the broom closet of his building, it's rough. It's really, really rough. In the President Lex special that came out, which I think you and I both have in one of those, the older President Lex trade paperbacks.
No, I got the new one.
Oh, you have the new one. Good man. All right.
The one that has the
very good
Art of the Deal cover on it.
Very nice.
I couldn't resist.
But there's like a 2-page short story in that issue where Lex visits baby Clark, Lana and Pete's child, the nursery, and he's having this whispered conversation with Lana about like, how could you go along with Pete Ross being Lex's VP? And he references her torture. It was a good callback.
Absolutely.
A great callback. How could you how could you go along with this knowing what Lex did? And she has this whole thing about like, we can't prove it. We never knew for sure. We can't prove it. And this is an opportunity for Pete. And after Superman leaves, she has this line to Baby Clark where she's like, maybe something will happen to Lex, to the bad man. And then Daddy can be president. So, Lana had her own stuff going on, but there's that piece of all of this. Well, again, when we talk about just the inhumanity and the coldness and the cruelness of all of this, the torturing of Lana, the cuckolding of Perry White, the indecent proposal of this waitress, it's like many, many instances of this. Anyway, but yeah, with Lex refusing to accept the results, it's like, again, this idea of it just not computing. The idea that someone would have this power, not use it for personal gain, not allow himself to be bought or controlled, would position him, would position himself in this like lower position, in society. Like just none of it tracks for him.
Which, if you think about it, is actually a really nice pre-crisis callback to the annual For the Man Who Has Everything. Because when Mongol imagines what Superman's ultimate fantasy world would be when he's under the influence of the Black Mercy, all Mongol can imagine is Superman like basically sitting on a throne of skulls, having conquered the entire universe, because any man with that much power, that's all they could possibly want, right? That has to be Superman's ultimate goal. And Mongol only thinks that way because that would be his ultimate goal of what he would do with that power. And of course, we learn from the issue that Clark just wants a life with a wife and a kid and a dog, and that idyllic American life. And here I think Lex to some extent is thinking of Superman in the same way, because Lex is projecting onto Superman what he would do if he had that power, rather than thinking about who Superman actually is. He won't accept that someone is genuinely that good. So I actually like that for that connection. But I think that if you really look at everything Lex has done in all of these issues and all of these episodes, this idea of I'm going to use kryptonite, or I'm going to position Metallo as superior man, or I'm going to create a Bizarro, because in this he actually has Bizarro created. This has come from another world. I'm going to use these robots. I'm going to do all of these things to discredit and undermine Superman for essentially and even to your point about, kidnapping and beating Lana, because he knew it would lure Superman. He knows that there's some connection between the two of them. It would absolutely lure Superman, and he could learn who Superman is. And then he gets it. All of his machinations work. He succeeds. He wins. And the arrogance that he just throws it out the window, because there doesn't even really seem to be that much compelling evidence other than, no, any man with that much power. That's what I wrestle with, because you have it. You did it. And you rejected it.
Yeah, I don't know. On the one hand, there's something very poetic about it, but on the other hand, yeah, it is like, it does sort of undermine the character's, intelligence and ability to reason, that it's like he's so quick to dismiss it. And also, not to nitpick this, but it's like, if you think that Superman has some sort of disguise, who do you think he would be? Like, do you like that's the thing? Like, oh, he wouldn't just. Well, but that's the thing, is like, to be a mere human. So it's like, I don't know what Lex was expecting to find. So I don't know. Like that's a little bit hard to answer. But, and I don't know if this was exactly what you were getting at, but when you were saying that it'd be interesting, for Lex to have something over him. Look, I've been advocating this on this podcast for 2 years now, or in multiple episodes. Most people disagree with me, but I'll say this now in this episode, there are 2 scenes in everything that we've read that, actually, you know what, maybe 3. I might have to throw Batman v Superman in there. Yeah, all right, 3. 3 scenes that for me represent the ideal Superman Lex dynamic. And I wish we could see stories run with this for a while. And it's the dynamic where Lex knows Clark is Superman. And in comics, this was not assigned, and I covered this at the end of last year when Mike and I looked at the rest of the Joe Kelly era of Action Comics, but there was that ending battle storyline where someone knows Clark is Superman and all of these villains are attacking like everyone in his life, like his accountant and his dentist. Like it's a little over the top, but that's the gist of it. And Superman confronts Lex on his, private, he's president at this point. He's got this secret, his own fortress that no one on Earth knows about, but Superman finds him. Oh, it was such a great bit. Lex is like, literally no one knows about this. Like, how did you find me? And then he takes a beat and he goes, you memorized my heartbeat, didn't you? And that was how Superman had found him.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
But, Superman is still kind of dancing around it. And he's, like asking Lex some questions. And he's like, why don't you just come out and ask me? And Superman goes like, do you know who I am? He's like, yes, Clark, I know. And they have like a very measured, reasoned discussion. And Lex is ultimately like, the reason I'm not going to use this against you is because of her, because of Lois. And it was a perfectly valid explanation for it. It's like, okay, this is why Lex wouldn't blow up Superman's world. I don't know. That might undermine our argument about he doesn't know how to love. He seems to, if there were no true feeling, maybe he would go after. I don't know. That's debatable. But it's like a few pages and by the end of the storyline, Manchester Black, who is responsible for Lex figuring out that Clark is Superman, removes that information from Lex's head. Right. So it's so short-lived. Similarly, in the series finale of Smallville, one of my favorite moments from the entire series is when Clark and Lex have this showdown. And then later on in that episode, all of Lex's memories are erased. And then in Batman v Superman, when, of course, Lex has figured out that Clark is Superman, of that rooftop confrontation. Yeah. That to me, and I might be in the minority on this, I don't care. That to me represents, I think, the most interesting dynamic. Because this whole idea of like, oh, Lex can't figure it out, or he rejects the results when he gets them or whatever. It's like, okay. But the idea that they can have this, going back to this intimacy, right? Like Lex lets his guard down around Superman. The idea that Superman could it has to do the same because Lex knows. And whether it's because it's power over Superman or he loves Lois or whatever reason you want to attribute it to, or in the context of Smallville, there's some bedrock of friendship that's still there. They might hate each other now, but it's like, you were my best friend once. Like, I'm not going to use your identity against you. I think it could work. And those are three instances. The first two in particular, Batman v Superman, I'll kind of circle back to, but those first two, that to me is like, those are my favorite scenes.
I agree. I think used well and in a well-told story, I think it could be really, really interesting and would be such a great status quo shift for the Superman comics. I think that we're sort of in a place now where it can't happen because in the recently concluded Bendis era, Superman reveals his identity to the entire world. So, Lex knowing the identity really doesn't mean anything anymore.
Wait, I'm sorry. You're a parent, so you'll probably appreciate this. You know the song "We Don't Talk About Bruno" from Encanto?
Oh, do I know that song?
We don't talk about Bendis.
We don't. No, there were. I know this is not what we were meant to talk about, but since you already recorded those episodes and I already listened to them, I'll briefly weigh in. I checked it out because I've been a fan of Brian Michael Bendis for a long time. And while ultimately I agreed with you that I did not love this particular era, I liked the Superman book a lot more than I liked the Action Comics book. And a lot of that had to do with Ivan Rice's art because he's just so brilliant. I love him. But there were a couple of very interesting ideas that Bendis had, one of which being the reveal of Clark Kent as Superman. And I even sort of bought into the reasoning behind it, him getting to a point after a long career as the premier superhero in the DC universe saying, look, I have stated over and over and over again that I stand for truth. It's the first word in his motto, right? Truth before justice and everything else. How can I reasonably serve these people in the name of truth if I am ultimately always lying to them? And so I get it. I agree with you though that I think it may have been a wasted opportunity to start at least with Lex knowing the secret. I think if you've got Lex who, however he figures it out, lets Clark know that he knows. doesn't do anything with it right away because it's much more delicious to let Superman wonder when it's going to come. It's like the slap on How I Met Your Mother, right? Right? It's much better to not use the slaps and let Barney wonder when the next one's coming. It's like, let Superman live in a little bit of fear. Lex has the upper hand, and to Lex, that's everything. Whether he uses it or not is irrelevant, knowing that he's got something that he can use. Let that play out for a little while. And then the way you thwart that is reveal your identity to the world. So now that weapon that you have means nothing.
I like that. I would still not be on board with the full unmasking, but so to speak, but I think that definitely would have been more compelling. I mean, I guess the way I look at it is we've seen this tangible instance of Lex holding Superman at bay with a kryptonite ring. So this would just be another version of that, or a replacement for that. I guess that's kind of the way I would look at it. And kind of going back to what you were saying before, it's like, well, what is the, objective here? If it's not necessarily to kill him, but it's to outmaneuver him or to undermine him, it's like you can use that. So I don't know. I think that, again, those scenes that I had mentioned, I wish they had more of an opportunity to play out. Like, I wish that Lex didn't find out Clark's secret in Smallville, like at the very end. Yeah. I wish that, that scene that we got in Ending Battle in the comics, and I wish that it's so short-lived because his memory is erased so shortly thereafter. So like, I just wish these things had been able to play out, even if it's not, I can live with it not being the status quo forever, but I do think there's a missed opportunity. I think the example that you cited is a great instance of that. So, I mentioned in that story, Ending Battle, Lex referencing his love of Lois. And when we talk about Smallville next, we'll talk about the being a romantic rival for Lana's affections. But, certainly in these stories, and in the Man of Steel #4, like the first time we meet Lex, Lois and Clark are going to this event that he's hosting on his boat. And he sent this very expensive dress for Lois. And it's very clear that he has designs on her, but Lois quickly rebuffs that, and she senses what we see as readers, that he's looking to possess her the same way he does everything else. I guess when it comes to Lex and Lois, and this is pretty present in my mind, having just rewatched the first season of Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman, which culminates in an almost wedding between Lex and Lois.
I do remember that.
I mean, to what extent, if any, do you like Lex, or do you see Lex as a viable romantic option in the animated series as well? In the concluding chapter of that series premiere, Lois makes a remark to Clark about how she dumped him. So, like, you don't know the full extent of what if any relationship they have, but there's some sort of history there. So we get like a number of instances of this across media. To what extent, if any, do you like him as a romantic interest for Lois?
I don't think I could ever really buy it, because I think right on the face of it, Lois is just better, and she's smart enough to see right through him. If he's interested in her, again, I'm going to go back to what you said earlier, because I absolutely agree with it. I don't think he's capable of having any genuine affection for her. It would be more a relationship based on what she can do for him. I mean, having the premier reporter at the Daily Planet in his pocket as his paramour would certainly be beneficial to him in a professional capacity. Insofar as Lex's relationship with Clark, not Superman, but Clark develops, it would certainly benefit him knowing that, I got her and you didn't. And then later, when it's clear that Superman and Lois are an item, I think Lex would love to just, be able to either have her first or steal her away. I just don't see Lois, at least the Lois we know today, I don't see her as giving that a second thought.
And I think that was one of the things rewatching season 1 of Lois and Clark that was kind of tough. I mean, there were a couple of things there. Neither my wife nor I really bought the chemistry between the two of them, as much as, again, John Shea's Lex was, far more charismatic than what we were getting in the comics, but it's still just, It was a little tough to buy, and I didn't think Lois came off great in that first season. It really felt like, she was settling for Lex, and not to defend Lex, but it's like, it's not a good look for any of them. It's like clearly she had, interest in Superman, potentially Clark, at that point. So, that was a little tough.
Yeah. And one of my issues in general with the show was that because they were playing up the romantic comedy element of it, rather than, as a straight superhero show or drama like Smallville, Lois does not come off as smart, as capable, as driven as I imagine Lois to be, because at the end of the day, she's the romantic interest who has romantic interests of her own. And so when she's always sort of being relegated to a player in a romance, Lois is so fiercely independent. And so again, once you put her in that genre, the goal is to make her not independent. The goal is to partner her up, whether it's the ruse of Lex Luthor or the ultimate marriage to Clark. I don't know. I never, it's one of the reasons why I never really loved the show. I watched it at the time. It was fine, but even rewatching it now, I couldn't get into that version of Lex, as lovely as I think Terry Hatcher is. I just didn't, I don't know. I needed Lois to be a little stronger.
That's fair. I do get what you're saying. I will say that with the idea of Lex as a viable romantic interest for Lois, I think that, and this was something that my wife and I were talking about in those episodes we did, where it's like, how much do we buy that it's genuine versus him just wanting to control her, to have influence over what she can write in the Daily Planet, Yeah. And I think that, and I don't know, I guess it's a fine line to walk, but I think if there's a way first of all, I'm not clamoring for Lex Lois romance stories, to be honest. But I guess if it's going to happen in iterations, I think that if it can be genuine for as much, I guess that's the thing. It's like, if that's the one thing he's capable of feeling in a real way, then I can buy it a little bit more. But it's one of those things, like, if she can't see who he really is as this evil businessman, and she can't see that he's just trying to possess her, then like her character really suffers. So if there's something real, then I think maybe I could be a little bit more open to it. But I don't know. I can't say I've seen any story yet where I'm like, oh, okay, I could kind of see why this is happening.
I think if it's going to work, I feel like it's going to be in a story where you have to take the chronology back down to almost zero, where, Lex is essentially an unknown quantity, not good, not bad, just new. And if he is charming enough and powerful enough and philanthropic enough, he might get the eye of a Lois Lane, right? She's influential and powerful in her own way. He is. Maybe they do sort of work if there isn't a Clark Kent in the picture yet, if there isn't necessarily a Superman in the picture yet to that extent, and you take it all the way back and build the relationship up from nothing. I could see it working for a period, but obviously it would have to come to a head at a certain point where she realizes it, because you can't do to her in that relationship what was done to her in her Clark Kent relationship for decades, which is where this Pulitzer Prize winning reporter can't see that the two guys that she spends the most time with are the same guy. She just comes off looking stupid.
I know that is a very tough pill to swallow. So one more thing I just want to say about Lois and Clark. I haven't done my full season 2 rewatch yet, but I did watch Lex's one episode from season 2, Phoenix, where he rises from the dead. What was interesting about that, spoiler, sorry people, but what was interesting about that one was it definitely hearkened more to the pre-crisis versions, like the mad science of his return. It's not at his own hand of he's dead, but his doctor, Gretchen Kelly, right? So they bring her in from the comics, and his assistant, Nigel, they put him in this chamber, and he rises, but he loses his hair. So we finally have the baldness. He doesn't seem too affected by it. In fact, he's like, the hair starts to fall out. He's like, shave it. So he doesn't have the reaction that the pre-crisis Lex did. But, he finally is in that bald look that we had been deprived of in the entire first season. He's brought back by this mad science. And then I think I was very tickled by the disguises that he wears throughout the episode. Like he puts on a janitor's outfit and like this huge handlebar mustache. He's like walking around the Daily Planet, and he also disguises himself as an old man in a wheelchair, and he's having these interactions with Lois. Because that was like a big thing in the pre-crisis stories, where he would always have these disguises, and his name would be an anagram of Luthor.
Right.
So it's interesting to see that. It felt like a lot of the versions of Lex kind of came to a head in that one. So if anyone's looking for like a cool Lex episode from Lois and Clark, I would recommend that one from season 2. Not to rush through things, but as we're almost about to hit the 2-hour mark, a couple of we've hit on almost everything that I had on my list, and anything that's left that you want to get to, of course, I want to talk about. But one of the things, because this becomes a bigger issue, I think, in stories that I'm going to talk about next time, but there's not as much xenophobia in this version of Lex that there is, I think, in the next batch of stories that I'm going to be looking at. And that was actually one of the interesting things about this entire period in Superman comics. Like his alien heritage, it's not dismissed. They do deal with it. What's interesting in Man of Steel, right? He doesn't find out that he's an alien from Krypton until the end of the story. He's like a few years into his tenure at this point, right? And when Metallo attacks, he's been created by the scientist who has, tracked Superman's ship. And, Metallo's alluding to the alien origin. And Lois is like, "Are you an alien?" And at this point, he's learned. He's like, "Yes, I am." Like, does that change anything? And she's like, "No, I don't think so." And you kind of see that play out even in the animated series. Like he tells her he's from Krypton. Like it's not as much of a sticking point as it becomes in later stories. And even from Lex, like as much as he acknowledges that he's not human, he's an alien, it's not said with the same hate that I think you see in the later stories. Did you find that too?
Yeah, I mean, the one instance I even have in my notes that alien even became an issue was in the For All Seasons issue where Lex blames an alien for some new virus.
Right.
I've always liked the version of Lex, and we didn't really see it too much in the stuff that we prepared for this, but I've always liked that version of one of the sticking points for his resentment of Superman is that if anyone's going to be the savior of the city or the world, it should be a human being, one of the people who actually inhabit this world, one of the people who belong here. And the fact that it is an alien just rankles him. And not just an alien, but an alien who pretends to be one of us, who has a secret identity where, he blends in and is lying to those around them, convincing them that he is in fact human, as opposed to, let's say, a Martian Manhunter who there's no pretense there. He's this green shape-shifting alien. And as troubling as that might be for Lex, at least he's honest about who he is. Superman is not. And I think there's interesting things that have been done with that. I think there are more interesting things that probably could be done with that. Again, I hate to get political, but I think that in the recent discussions about illegal aliens and immigration that we've been having over the last couple of years, a lot of the same sentiments have popped up, not of aliens from space, but aliens from other countries, and the same sort of vitriol that has been leveled against them, coming to the country illegally, stealing jobs, or whatever has been sort of leveled against them. I think there's a relevance, a timeliness to a story like that involving some aliens in the DC universe, whether it's, Hawkman, Martian Manhunter, Superman. I think there is a way to do that and have it play really well. So I do like that trick if they can pull it off.
I do too. I mean, that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to do these episodes, was to look at the ways in which the motivations have changed. And like I said, pre-crisis, you had this grudge. He blamed Superman or Superboy for the baldness. Again, in the next batch of stories that I look at next week, we think we'll get into that xenophobia, which is especially relevant today. And in the final episode that we do, it's going to be a look at the more philosophical objections that Lex has to Superman. The idea of what effect would it have if the people in this fictional DC universe, right, but look to Superman to solve all of their problems? Does that hinder human advancement? And so, again, it's very different than what we're talking about in this episode. This, where, there, and I don't mean to be, to reduce it, and poke fun at it, but this idea of like, he's the highest one in the city until Superman shows up. And, and that seems to be the root of it. Like, I do think there are other iterations here. We do have a more compelling reason for the differences between them. But, again, this evil businessman version, I think there is a lot of really great stuff that comes from it.
Yeah. And ultimately, we're really looking at about 15 years worth of story. And so, yeah, you're right. To reduce it to one thing would be obviously silly and reductive, but we watch over these 15 years this evolution of the character. First of all, the immediate evolution from pre-crisis to post-crisis, and then this slow build from schlubby evil businessman to more charming president. And I think we do get some nuance. I think we do get some complexity. It's not consistent. Again, when you have that many titles being produced that frequently by this many creators, I just don't think it's possible. Even the editorial staff, changed over that period. So, I just don't. I think we, part of it is we may be asking too much because we're looking at all of it in hindsight, as opposed to on the ground producing these books, month to month, and in that triangle era, really from Byrne on, like. We're talking about weekly comics. Look, Superman book every week of the month. So, it's hard to get that sort of consistency, but it would be nice. And I don't think it's a worthless experience to sort of hope for it or want the books to be as good as they can possibly be. And maybe now where we have the rise of sort of more comic book auteurs who really kind of take on the book and own it, for better or for worse, maybe we do get a consistent vision over the course of several years that nail down a version of Lex that we just love and becomes our new Lex.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say, overall, again, I really enjoyed these stories, and I do like this version of Lex. Would I say this is my definitive version? No, but I really do like a Lex who, has something on Superman, whether it's that Superman can't prove Lex's misdeeds or he has this kryptonite ring that's keeping him at bay. Again, the scene that we keep talking about of Lex hovering outside the window, like this dynamic between them, I think it really is interesting and challenges Superman in a different way than we had seen in all of those pre-crisis stories. The main thing that was missing for me was humanity, was something to sort of root for, to allow me to see from Lex's perspective. Again, I think he just, like I said, came off, more cruel than anything else in a lot of these instances. But some with some exceptions. And as we wind down, just to talk about his family a little bit, I did think one of the, really interesting moments in Superman for All Seasons #3 was when Lex was recounting in his inner monologue, a moment from his youth when his father hit him, and the father said, "This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you." And Lex refused to cry or to plead. He just stared his father in the eye the entire time. And Lex says at the end of it, "I think it did hurt him more than it hurt me. And it taught me," I said, "I learned from my father to always give people what they want, but always for a price." So this idea of a price, like he feels like everyone has a price, but also it's like he's going to take. Anything he gives, he's going to take. And in that very issue, right, he creates this virus that knocks out all of Metropolis. He makes Superman think it's because he's an alien. And that really, in all these stories that we're talking about, the For All Seasons one, that might be the main one, where like Lex quote unquote wins at the end of it. We still have part 4 and Superman will come back. But at the end of part 3, like Superman's confidence is really shaken. He doesn't know if he's responsible for this virus. And even beyond that, Lex creates this, this poison character, right? Who has the cure for it, but she dies in the process. And it's all orchestrated by Lex. And, Superman feels responsible for this life he lost. And again, it really rattles him. So, Lex has the upper hand at the end of that issue. And, Superman goes back to Smallville and he doesn't know if he's going back.
Well, because if there's one thing we've learned from all of this, when it comes to that idea of a price, Luthor will always take more than he gives. Right? He'll always come out the victor in that exchange. He will never allow himself to be taken advantage of in any way. So he's always going to get the better end of that deal. And maybe that's the defining characteristic, right? That in every relationship, in every business dealing, in everything that he does, he will ensure that he ends up on top, that he ends up with more than the other person.
Well, maybe the last main thing that I want to say to kind of build off of that, and also what we've been saying about his inability to love, I really have a very hard time with Lex's sacrificing baby Lena at the end of Y2K to Brainiac 13 in exchange for control over this futuristic technology that will allow him to now rule Metropolis in a whole new way, right? And I don't know. I mean, it's like, and maybe this is now as a father, it hits me even more so. But, we talk about all these instances of the cruelty, but, he sacrifices his daughter and, he says something to Superman. I didn't reread this specifically for this, but he says something to Superman at the end of it. Like, I paid a price, like more than you'll know. And so it's not like it's totally lost on him, but at the same time, that's the life of your child. Again, just a number of these instances where it's just, I don't know. I guess maybe I would have hoped that fatherhood would have, like we were talking about with him and Lois in this hypothetical scenario, like the one real thing in his heart, that would allow us to empathize with him a little bit. I mean, I don't know. What is your take on the sacrificing of Lena?
Well, look, you and I as fathers, I think could never relate.
Oh, and I'm not saying, yeah, in fairness, I'm not. Scott, what do you think? Do you think that was the right call?
Yeah, I mean, listen, that's why I had 4 children, because one day if I have to sacrifice one of them, I still have 3. No, it's the most horrendous acts that you can imagine somebody committing, and it is villainous and all of that. But if you take the emotion out of it, which I think we've been saying since the beginning of our talk tonight, that he, if he really is incapable of having genuine affection for anybody, even his own blood, what he gains from that exchange is objectively, again, it's not my personal view, but objectively what he gains is so much more than what he'd get from having a child, which is very small. It is this very contained experience of raising a child, as opposed to, I now have literal control over the entire city of Metropolis, which has been what I've been trying to do for my entire adult life. I see.
And not to be ghoulish about this, but we know with insurance companies, right? Like in a wrongful death suit or whatever it is, it's like they have to put literal value on someone's life. And so if Lex is engaging in a similar calculation here, and like you said, taking the emotion out of it, I guess maybe his decision does track in the context of that character. And maybe this is where I'll start next week with Lex's inability to love. But even across Smallville, I do like to believe that the friendship that he had with Clark was genuine. But even from the early stages of that, he suspected that there was more to Clark, and he had his secret room on Clark and everything. So, this idea of like what Lex is truly, genuinely capable of from an emotional standpoint, I think is a valid question. And so with that in mind, the sacrificing of Lena, again, I think in that context makes sense. I mean, I think overall, And I guess I don't say any of this really to criticize the stories per se. I think it is ultimately a matter of preference, like how much you really want to empathize with the villain. I guess, it's funny because, like, I don't have these same qualms about, like Brainiac. But Brainiac's not human. I guess maybe that's where somewhat of the line is. And, you look at another villain like Zod, it's like you do empathize with Zod to a fair extent. It's like you really, like, that's the thing. You get where that guy's coming from. So with Lex, I think that's where, I guess that's the thing. I know this might sound very obvious, but it's like out of all of the villains, he's the most human of them all on paper, but behaves the least human in many respects. There you go.
That's a nice way to look at it. Sounds like a good pin.
Yeah.
For the episode. I'm there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to top that. So yeah, I'm with you.
That's the tragedy of Lex. So we can't stop here. Is there anything else? I know, we didn't go story by story, but I mean, we touched on all of them that we had read or watched for this. Was there anything that we didn't talk about that you had wanted to?
So I'll end on a note of Levin. One of my most favorite Lex Luthor moments, and I fully admit that I am a sucker for a mind swap story. I'm a sucker for it. In Justice League Unlimited, they do a story where Lex Luthor and Wally West's Flash swap minds, and each one of them has this just brilliantly comedic moment. So Lex Luthor in Wally West's body sneaks away because he's got to unmask and finally see who the Flash is. And he gets to the mirror and he rips the mask off, and there's this beat, and he just goes, I don't know who this is. and it's this moment of, I love that moment. And on the flip side of it, you've got Wally West in Lex Luthor's body, who, when he realizes he's in this body, he has to sneak away from all the other villains in the Injustice gang or whatever group they're in. And he sneaks away to the bathroom just to compose himself and figure out what to do next. And he has this meeting with Dr. Phosphorus or one of the others. And then he walks out of the bathroom, and another villain confronts him and says, wait a minute, did you wash your hands? And he thinks for a moment and says, no, because I'm evil. It's just one of those Lex Luthor moments that I just love. It's a great way to play with this character, as you said, is so supremely cruel and inhuman, but do it in a way it's certainly still consistent with the character, but I don't know, I get such a kick out of that.
Yeah, that's the great brain robbery. And
right.
I was smiling the whole time you were laying that out, because that was one of the ones that I watched the other night, and it held up great. It's so funny.
It's so funny.
And of course, I know as fans know, but Michael Rosenbaum voiced the Flash, so it's like he was effectively playing Lex Luthor in that episode. But to his credit, it's like it didn't sound like Lex from Smallville. Like he was really doing Clancy Brown. Like it was great. Yep. It is such a great episode.
I agree.
For sure. Well, listen, I'm sorry I kept you so long.
No apologies necessary. This was a blast.
This was great. I really had such a great time just kind of delving into this version of Lex that I spent so much time with in my childhood, but now I can look at from an entirely different perspective. So thank you very much, Scott. You will be back on the show this fall for our Death to Wedding event. You'll be joining me for the final chapter of that, where we'll be looking at the breakup of Lois and Clark, and then their eventual reconciliation and wedding. So I look forward to comparing notes with you when we get there.
Can't wait. And I can't wait to listen to the rest of the episodes in this Lex Luthor series. I'm fascinated by it and can't wait to see what your other guests have to say about it.
Well, thank you. And speaking of that, next week we will be joined by sweet Bernie Gerstmayr, and we'll be talking about the Nemesis. So this week was the evil businessman. Next week will be the Nemesis. And we will talk about those stories that, again, brought back a number of pre-crisis elements. So there's a lot still to come. Audience, thank you, as always, for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Make sure you come back next week. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. The spin-off podcast, Digging for Justice, a DC fan journey, is available now exclusively at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, starting at the $1 level. New episodes release monthly, and many more rewards are available too. including a robust back catalog of bonus podcasts. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show.